the Sickman's working group for commissioning the work that artists produce. And as I say, this video will be part of their own archive as they expand their work on incorporating Indigenous laws into the process. That's a publicly available resource. But that's the foundation and springboard by which we wanted to then embark on the discussion today. And how do we answer some of the questions that are thinking around what artists introduced. As I say, we've broken the agenda down into what is reflected in the topics for discussion, but this might be an appropriate time to hear your presentation, or for you to present some of your own remarks before we get any further into these topics. Is that okay, Chief?
Yeah. Where are you going? Heading out the door. So, we met last night and talked about this. I'm actually kind of glad that most of what you have been talking about is what we talked about last night. Independent bodies and things like that. We thought that it might be worth the exercise of hearing from Jerry's gone now too. Open. Hearing from Jerry. Jerry was chief. When was he chief? In the 80s, right? And Stuart saying they were instrumental in setting. So they were involved back in the day with the TAR program and the specific claims. And I thought it would be good just to hear what they have to say, because now their elders are sitting back at the table. Jerry's on council, and but this is very frustrating. I'm not sure which one of you wanted to go first. Sure. You want to kick it off? Sure. And we provided, is this chart that, Marina, is this chart, can we share that chart?
Oh.
Okay, first of all, my indigenous name is Siutinachakos, and that means North Star in Nihil language. So we're Anishinaabe Nihil, free and so or give away whatever you want to call it. And I think what the lady was talking about there, about the also have to be part of what we develop, in a sense. And that's not saying that we take back ourselves back in time. It's about moving with those indigenous laws and how we view the world, how we view the land as indigenous peoples into the future. So we make decisions that are based on truth, respect, caring, love, all those laws that we have as indigenous peoples all across Canada, Turtle Island, whatever you want to call it, also on the land. And she mentioned about the land itself and how the land is our university as indigenous peoples, where we learn our culture, our societies, about how we interact with each other, how we make decisions, all those things. Very, very important if we're going to move into this future as the people that we once were, so to speak, that carried ourselves with that integrity and that honor. In order to move into the future, we have to bring that back. Where there was, I'm not very good with the English language, but to me, bringing back that what we lost through of our culture, and where we became a limbo nation, sitting in the dark because we lost that because of what happened. We don't know what happened. So that's what the lady was talking about, is that we do have to bring that back and use those those laws, those principles, those values that we hold dearly into these discussions, so that the resolutions will reflect that, and the resolutions will reflect that it's transparency and it's honor and it's integrity, all that stuff. And it's not about taking over Canada or whatever, or making other people lose out. It's actually taking over in a sense where we all belong together on this land, whether we're Indigenous peoples or not. We're all going to be here in the future, so that means we'll find that way through these, our laws, work with their laws to move into the future together, as it was meant to be through the wampum belt, side by side. It's not so that we can interfere in their laws or they can interfere in our laws. That solution in between. A lot of people say that we have to, reinvent the treaty or reinvent whatever it may be. What we need to do is reinvent that, from their laws to our laws, reinvent that thing in between, that relationship. That's all we have to reinvent. We don't have to rewrite our treaties. We don't have to rewrite anything. What we need to do is write what that relationship is between the nation to nation thing. And part of it is specific claims. If you want to call it, that's just a tiny division of what we're talking about as a whole, right? But if we're going to do it right, we have to do it that way. We're involved years ago, with the other chiefs that aren't with us today, and leaders, like friends of mine from way back, Jerry, the late Chief Medicchia, and Chief Kelvin Davis, and we started talking about these claims 30 years ago, and about how they were wrong. And we brought Peter years ago into Treaty 8 from, I think he came out of the IAA at that time, Indian Association of Alberta, and I think Joe Dion and others like that were in the, starting those claims, okay, way back. And when Peter got here, what we were talking about is, how claims are being done back then, and because they were done to the strict standard them days of the government, and how they seen claims being brought forward, and to their strict standards and to their making the process very limited as to what you could define or bring forward as a claim. It was like I told people it's like a process where you're asking the fox to go count your hens, and he comes back. I told people he comes back licking his lips and there's feathers flying out of his mouth and saying everything's okay. They're all good. But we didn't necessarily understand what he meant by good. It meant they were good tasting. And the hen, that's our land, our resources, our language, our culture, all that stuff. That's what that's about. And that's what this is about. It's about making things right and just so that there's fairness in that two-row wampum we talk about, so we can walk side by side, nation to nation with each other. That's what that is about, and that's where we have to take this also. Everything we talk about going into the future, well, we have to regroup as a people and relearn ourselves, who we are, and part of those processes are these. Oh shit. Oh, sorry. I was supposed to be at a meeting, or an important family meeting. But those are the things that moving forward we need to pick back up. And of course, claims are developed by our master, the federal government, right? And they made the rules on how I can make a claim against you, so to speak. Yeah. No, you can't make a claim against me. Here's how you do it. Oh, okay. So they're limited, right? Of course. And they're one-sided. It accommodates them so that eventually they do, in reality, they do eradicate who we are as a people. And
they get what they've always wanted through the, white paper policy that they've started, the Charlottetown Accord that they started. It's one of the processes, I say, of the Pac-Man approach of our peoples to destroy our peoples and our way of what they're going to be doing to us into the future. And they've started it already. So, that's what's happening. And that's why with this independent body, it's just one of the many things that we have to deal with as Indigenous peoples. But this could be, I say, a leading thing where could be change throughout the whole table that we need to create as nations across Canada to addressing ourselves as a people and as a real nation-to-nation relationship with Canada. And that's where I say that in that nation-to-nation, we don't have to revamp anything. It's defining that relationship so that it sets the rules and parameters of how we interact with each other, based on our Indigenous laws and their laws. We don't have to put anything into a melting pot. So I think it's really important that we move towards this independent body and address those things of funding that we've been lacking, and because when you start to talk about claims, there's so many things that you could research that we can't research to the level that we want to, so that we have a well-informed claim of information to make informed decisions on how to resolve it fairly and equitably, in all levels. If we had that, then we'd have a just system to be able to put it through. And if this independent body can begin to address some of those things, that's where we want to go. Yeah. So we get rid of the fox and quit asking the fox to go count our hens and rely on that fox to come back with the real answers. So with that, I do have to go. It's a family matter. Okay.
Going back into, as I mentioned earlier about the Kenner reports and all that, working on all those things with the province, going to Ottawa, going to Montreal, trying to focus in Alberta relationship for our treaty here in BC, going to Vancouver. And even back then, they were trying to negotiate their own treaty, the province. And we were at the table when we said, hey, we do have a treaty 1899. And right now, the door shuts, and you guys can sit over there. We have something else going on here. And we thought that's the reason why in Vancouver we need to make sure that we're focused on the treaty that's in existence up here, and the topics of discussion down there is a whole different level, and we wanted to continue what we have here. But we're educating our people. My granddaughter is going to law school now. And I told her, I said, oh, well, what are you going to do? I'm going to study law so we can understand the government better for our people. And at such a young age, she's thinking, for tomorrow already. And when I look at this thing from 1899 up to 2019, we've been set back and sidetracked so many times that the wheel is squeaking, but it's not getting anywhere. We have to have a change of policy to make better ideas to move forward. And Stuart mentioned the resources. And the government has given us just enough to move, but when we're getting somewhere, that's when the funding gets cut off. And we start letting go of people again. And we can't keep bringing in somebody else again and like start fresh, and it's just not getting anywhere. The late Joe Matthias, had a chance to talk to him towards his latter years. He said, you know, Jerry, this will never be settled in our lifetime, and maybe our great grandkids might be able to get somewhere to see the light. And he's right. That's the vision I've seen here. You know, but we have to keep going. And if this new thing is in place, I mentioned we need to have a representative here from this area in Treaty 8BC to be part of the workforce there. Because there's a lot of things in here that, you know, I know you had 80 to 100 people probably down there yesterday. But here we have massive land, but the population is so small. And, you know, we can't even go into breakout groups. We could probably discuss the whole things here. and I think if we can have representation from here and from this area that's directly working, we will get somewhere. And we do have a lot of information already from TAR here that's been compiled over the last quite a few years anyway.
Since 91,
Yeah. And if we can have something in place, but the thing is funding to get started over here. Going back to the cultural laws, I was brought up the cultural laws of the land and the people. And when people talk about the cultural land, the decision about the land reflects to the people. Okay. The decision about the people reflects back to the land. And the resources what the land gives us. And our nations from the past to the future. So we're always thinking about that. That's the ingredients of the law of the land. To be able to help yourselves, other nations, and people of the nations of the world. So we have to make very sound decisions if we're going to be here. And one of those things they're having a problem now is with that global warming, and you know, they can talk to everybody and we'll have a better tomorrow. That's the same thing here. We have to start here. If they're going to talk about the cultural laws, then we're going to get somewhere. And I think Pam, who's that lawyer from West Soto? working in the native laws.
Val Napoleon.
Val Napoleon. And I had a discussion with her a few years back, and which are some of the discussion that we had. So if we could maybe get her back here on maybe a meeting here, where we get somebody in place here to have a task force, then we'll be able to get some, maybe like bring some of the old chiefs and council that had been in the past, that they could put a committee together out of them and get it spearheaded again. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Gary Oker. I'm a counselor from Doig. I just want to add a few comments regards to what I feel about it and what has been happening in the past and what we need today and tomorrow for our economic needs. Our language and culture is the most important thing that describes our worldview. Without that description, we can't even understand Naching and Dreamer songs. You can't even remember those kind of things. Without those, I just find it very difficult to even describe some of these things. You guys heard one of the Dreamer songs this morning. That is what described it, and those are the songs that actually formulates relations and laws of the land. And a lot of people have different views over that. What is that law? For us, we know that we come from 12,000 years of history here. We have evidence at Chiquanta Charter Lake Cave that pinpoints in and around that time, where we can actually put our stories and that into that place. We've never lost that connection. We still have it today. The challenge we face here is the treaty in a very unique situation where the provincial government doesn't recognize it like the rest of Canada. So we do need a different platform to address the multiple uses of land use around here. Today we have corporations having more rights than the indigenous peoples. We have settlers that come here. We have other nations claiming over our territory without a due respect for the original people of the land, the Beaver people. In the future, I see the relatives, our relatives in the future, flying around using drone technologies to manage the land. Just like we are driving around today. I see in the future that that's going to happen, that new technologies will be adopted to make sure that we continue our connection to the land and managing what we need to do. Also see the opportunity for the sun to provide all our energy needs, and then also to look at the water system, so where we can control and distribute good water all over the world. There's also the vision of where our people have control of the natural foods and provide medicines to a large population of people, because we're using it from the context of medicine chests coming from the treaty. We need to adapt those contexts into contemporary and future needs. They also are great storytellers of our ancient past, just like we are now bringing back all the Dene people together. That's an ancient philosophy and prophecies of our ancestors that says the time will come when our people will get together again to be strong. So the Dene people next week are gathering in Calgary to Tene to be able to begin that process. Who are we as people to address that in a way that refines it in the context of Naching, Dreamer's ways, the songs, and the language. This is what I know. In 6 months' time, I'll be 60 years old. And the last 40 years, I've been involved in some various process of claims. And there's been people that sat there and fought and argued for the rights of our people that have passed away, including my grandparents, that with their testimonies, in their own language and their own knowing, help us be successful in one of our claims against the government. But they died before the claim was settled. I don't want to be one of those leaders that died before a settlement is done. We go around and round at these tables over and over again, talking about the same thing, talking about different things, but everybody's at a different level. We need to address a system that can be able to address the readiness of the nations to be able to move forward when they want to move forward. Not having to wait around and get everybody to be on the same page, because I don't think we'll all be on the same page. Yeah, we have the same inspiration to reclaim our territories, to make sure that there's justice done to give us the resources that we need in order to fulfill our obligations. So in the next 20 years, I don't want to be sitting around at this table. I want to be painting stories about our dreamers and not cheating. I want to write books about these things. I want to be able to translate our language into something that's useful, not to sit here in a meeting and arguing about, oh, we didn't finish our claim yet. It just goes on and on. So this claim business is not working for us today. We need our own process to settle these in the speed of business. That means let's get on with clarifying some of the things, such as like TLE right now. Everybody in this communities, and five of the communities here are in the TLE process. Dragging on, everybody's having a different opinion. That should be #1 priority for everybody before all the land gets taken up. Even if we want more land, how are you going to do that? Now we've got to fight because the government is taking it up or industry is picking it up. We got to take what we can now and get those things settled. That doesn't mean that outstanding claims are just going to be forgotten. I'm not suggesting that. But there are certain points where we got to negotiate those deals, just like our ancestors back in the day when they negotiated the treaty. They didn't know what was going to happen in the future, but at least they did it with a good heart and spirit and intent of having a relationship with the newcomers that's coming. We got to do the same thing today. We don't know what's going to happen 20, 30 years from now, but at least the intention that we can be able to provide something for our generations today so that we can deal with health and wellness of our people, education of our people, give them a role within our nation to provide services for us, is what we need to address today. So what I'm recommending is to really have a serious look about the Treaty 8BC because of the special circumstances it's in. The provincial government is the biggest block to our settlement. Even though they say they want to settle it, negotiate and do this, but they drag it on with so many multiple players having to answer to. And I'll give you an example how absurd it is. Even as a treaty person, an artist, a community leader, I want to build an art visibility project going towards the airport to put up a symbol of our nation, which is a teepee structure. They said we got to talk to everybody, including nations from Alberta. How absurd it has become, where we know that in the consultation issues is about major impact on our treaty. That's when it kicks in, not when we have to express. So when is the expression of our people having to become a consultation issue? I don't think it never existed, but because of the bureaucratic processes, it created this big industry basically of consultation, where they go around and around instead of dealing with the issue. Right now at the table is the treaty land entitlement. It's our #1 priority to get this done, so that we can be able to get on with our business of creating urban reserve, health and wellness for our community, and jobs and training for our young people. We can't manage poverty. And that's what's been going on. Social problems in our community with all kinds of addictions and things like that going on. Like, we spend more time doing that kind of thing instead of trying to come up with better solutions. So this is what I like to see. If AFN can be able to help and address this issue of regional, perhaps a regional platform for Treaty 8 Nation in BC to really address it. We can't deal with the BC people because by the time it gets down to Vancouver, they got their own agenda. They're in a whole different system. They're talking about rights. We already got our rights.
My name is Maisie Medici and I'm from Papua River First Nation. I grew up in Stony, where I grew up. My mom and dad raised us as kids. There's a bunch of family were together. And then in 63, between 61 and 63, Indian Affairs came and agent the Togalaba came to the community at where we live, and they want us to move. They want us to move to where we live right now in our community. When we were living in that bush, we were healthy. Nobody was sick. Babies were born. We had a wife in that community who delivered the babies. And we didn't go to those days. There's no hospital. There's no, how did that little baby survive? How did I survive when I was born in 1950? And all these things, our ancestors, the one who passed, give us all those stories to put it in here in our hearts, in our pockets, to keep it for, I have 4 great-grandboys. I had 3 granddaughters. I always pushed them for education. Education and health are very important to my community. And when we were living in Stony, they moved us to where we live right now. They built us a school in 55. They burned our school down. The Togalaba or somebody, whoever, they don't want first generation to get educated. Then we moved back to the community, and then the first built us a school, where they call Indian Day School. We all went to school there. And then later, some of us went to grade 8 and 9. They took us to like to Fort St. John, and they got there educated. And ancestors tell us all kinds of stories. The land is very important to First Nation, because when we live out of it, we eat berries. We make a book. This is our second book, how we make tradition, how we use the tradition medicine, how do we survive, what we do. It's all kind of stuff, berries, you name it. This is our second book we make, and I'm really happy that we did. I do language too. I worked with West Mongolia for 4 years to teach people language. I do everything for my community because I listen to my elders, my ancestors, the one who were in this world first. Kerry said, talk about his grandparents. Those our grandparents are very important to us. Even though we're small, we help them. Not today. You try to ask kids to get something for you or get mad. And there's a lot of addiction in our community, what Kerry says the same, you know. But we knew we need our land. Our land is very important. Every summer we go culture camp. teach those young guys, young boys or girls. They don't want to learn. The boys want to learn, but not the girls. But we never give up. In the springtime, they take them for trapping. Trapping is very important.
Is that your phone?
Very important to everybody because that's how we raised. Mr. My dad, go trapping. Everyone of the father of the community. Those days trapping money was better, like high. Sometimes that's it, got milk about this pile of link, coyote, whatever. We help. Me and my sister will help that skin squirrels and weasels for him. So we want to learn, he wants us to learn. He said, I'm not going to live with you guys forever, so you guys got to start learning how to survive in the bush. And now when we ask for trying to get those, not trying, but we want the people to give us a land to apply for land claim. We still, 16 years, I've been waiting for that. Nothing been done. Meetings to meetings, our councilor board meetings. And then they put the band together like West Wamble and Harper was one band, that's an old band. And then we separated, we separated from, now with the land claim, we have to go with a 50-50%. It's very, what Gary and Jerry saying, we should get our own, start working together like as one. Right now we're losing people. In August 18, my son died. He's only 50, he died. On September 18, my niece died. She just turned 31. Never received nothing what Gary was saying. It's sad, But we should, everyone should start working with us. Over here, they work with other community in South. I don't think they come over here. We should all get together once in a while and start working together as one. That's how people used to live. People love each other, so people help share a lot. If we kill moose, we share. We still do that in our community. So the elders could have something to eat. We care for elders. We love them because they're the one who was here before us. But we're losing young people and, elders, and I don't really I want everybody to be together working and work with those people who have addiction, help them, for help, and there's all kinds of help today. Us last year, a year ago, when we went to become counselors, they told us we have to go to Choices. We went to that program. That really helped us a lot. Like I used to drink, but in 1983, my mom talked to me, you have to quit that, what you're doing. I'm not going to live with you forever. Something's going to happen to me. How do she know? So I had to listen to my mom, and I quit it. I went for help, and then from there I never touched nothing. I don't do drugs. All those are addiction, but I listen to my mom. If today you talk to those young people, like what I'm saying right now, what mom told me, they're not going to believe it, or they're not going to listen. They think that drugs and alcohol are more important than anything. I'm really happy that Jerry talked and Gary, who I was here too last night. So we really need to work with you guys. That will be really great if we all work together, starting with our land things and get over with it, and then another thing come up, we'll deal with that the same way. That's all I have. Thank you.
Just one more thing before we break or something here. Just a question of other First Nations land claims in our already existing treaty territories. That's a real mind bogger coming, looking at the province. I don't, why are they allowing that happening when our treaties are already in existence? You know, that's just the topic there should be really looked at when we're looking at the claim files.
One of the topics or discussion or aspects of an independent process, an independent body, is being able to provide the kind of resources where there's a sharing of information, where we reflect more the principle of what it is to be transparent, that for there to be an entity that can facilitate that kind of openness. Because one of the handicaps that we have with the way the process works now is there are a lot of resources and energies spent in isolation to one another, and a lot of effort and a lot of studies and materials developed, but there is no repository where that could be available. And one of the aspects that's come out in our discussion was raised yesterday was, and one component of the independent body should be that. It should be not only a public education resource and tool, but it should be a repository for others within the same treaty area or within the same territories. Is the one constant is the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada is always the party on the other side. And there is a knowledge of study and research that they hold in that position, but we are handicapped because it doesn't exist on the other side.
So going back to the land and the people again, that when the subject of overlapping, and that doesn't exist in the First Nations culture. As far as I can remember, it was told to me, I'm 61 years old, and there is no overlapping with the respect of the land and its people. You do not go past this mountain. You do not cross that river. And a sacredness of the land and the people, the spirituality. You cannot put your moccasin print on somebody else's territory. That's disrespecting the Creator that made the land and the people. Talk to your neighbors. If you are lacking something, it's not too hard to talk to your neighbor and tell them, we are in this situation, our people are hurting, please help. Very simple. But do not just go in there and put your moccasin print on other people's territory. That we have different cultures, different tribes, and people respect that. And today, it's all overlapping. That came from economics of the world, and infringements on which way to generate revenue the quicker way. We talk to this guy and then tell these guys that they're overlapping and talk to two people going at one time, and then to access projects or whatever, that doesn't make sense. But when it comes to claims, these things are real, like Stuart mentioned this morning about these are the laws of the land that we have to follow. And if we don't, then we have a greater power up there that we have to deal with today. Yeah, I thought I'd bring that up.
Is this, oh, sorry, Nathan.
That's okay, but
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if you're gonna wind into whatever this independent body becomes, traditional laws, then I'm gonna keep pushing this indemnity thing, because if, in our cultures, as far as, I can only speak for Cree Soto, but as far as I know in every culture in North America, honor is at the forefront of those things. I heard Gary talk about it, my elder and former Chief Stewart, all of the elders in the room have mentioned it. If honor had been kept, there would be no cause for the indemnification clause. We wouldn't be in this stage right now. So I guess that has to be at the forefront of what you guys are fighting for, or fighting, what you guys are fighting with Canada over. Indemnity can't continue to be a part of that. That's like a thief or a rapist saying that I'll quit stealing or raping you if I get indemnification from any future charges from theft or rape. That's absolutely crazy. And that indemnity clause extinguishes our treaty rights as it goes forward. It continuously does it. We did it with cows and plows just recently. Now our grandkids will never be able to go get cows and plows. We chose that. We chose to do that. Our people did, and we did, and we signed it. So that indemnity can't be a part of Canada's argument as we go forward with specific claims. That extinguishes treaty rights. Granted, Peter might want to say it varies claim to claim apparently, but in my mind it's a little black and white, but I guess it depends on the claim. Like cows and plows is easy to explain, we signed that one right away. TLE could be argued that it's not extinguishing our treaty rights. I really hope that is a part of whatever process comes out of this, and it has to be at the front of it.
Would this be a good time for us to take a break?
Yes.
And then we can resume? Gosh, it's 11 o'clock already. 50 minutes, is that long enough? I'm in your hands.
Yep.
Which is a word used in English in the treaty. The Matsuan isn't what the treaty commissioners were thinking about when they used that word vacation. They were thinking about hunting, trapping, and fishing as ways of making a living and feeding themselves. But when the leaders who negotiated treaty on the First Nation side used Ramatsuan, what they were talking about was this cultural worldview and all of their values and all of their laws and customs, which was explained in that video. is the relationship of the Cree in that instance, but First Nations people, to all their relations and the mutual obligations that they have towards them. And that's very important, because to people like Siwapegaham, when he took treaty, he understood the treaty commissioners to say, you'll be just as free after the treaty to exercise your way of life in your usual locations. That meant to him, he would be able to, as part of this community, to govern their own use of these lands. I'm going to bring that up to today now. In 2010, I think it was, we had a court case called West Moberly, which was about caribou. We won at trial, and it was appealed to the BC Appellate Court. And in ruling, the BC Appellate Court said something that was foundational. They said the Crown can no longer assume that their rights are superior to the rights of the Danazaw. Those rights are co-equal. And the Crown, in approaching any decision that has the potential to affect the rights of the Danazaw, have to find a way to balance those rights with Crown rights at the beginning of the process. For the most part, the larger implications of that court case ignored by both the federal and the provincial Crown. The only time that the federal Crown has acted in accordance with it is in a environmental assessment that they undertook for HD Mining, who wanted to build a coal mine, which had the potential to have a small effect on caribou. In the context that West Moberly's decision was about caribou, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency held up the assessment on HD Mining's application for an environmental certificate for 2 years, and ultimately told the provincial government that because the habitat of caribou in the Quintet herd, which is the area where the mine was going to be placed, was already beyond the level of acceptable impact, that the province would have to come up with a plan that showed how that habitat would be restored before even a nominal impact on caribou could be permitted. And they said this isn't so much because of caribou as it is because the Treaty 8 people have this constitutionally protected right to hunt caribou in accordance with their traditional seasonal round. So that's what reconciliation means. It means that Crown governments have to sit down and talk to First Nations about changes to regulations, policies, and laws that will allow a peculiar kind of a balance to be established. And that balance is called optimization. It's the idea that you achieve the best protection over treaty rights and the best ability of treaty peoples to have peaceful enjoyment in the exercise of their rights, at the same time that you accomplish the best achievable economic development and resource development model that is consistent and compatible with protecting these treaty rights. I've always thought, and I've always advocated in the last 25 years, that to do this, we should be focusing more on the Crown's comprehensive claims policies than their specific claims policies. Because north of 60, where we have Treaty 8 First Nations and Treaty 11 First Nations, those treaty nations are allowed to participate under the comprehensive claims policy in actions with the Crown and Right of Canada that do address reconciliation of rights, interest, and governance authorities. So, from my perspective as a technician, the specific claims policy is too tightly constrained by existing legislation and policy, and by Crown's interpretation of those, to have the flexibility for achievement of reconciliation. And I think that reconciliation has to start with the kind of processes that Justice Arnaud described in his book on reconciliation, arising out of the Treaty Commission in Saskatchewan, or in the processes that we're undertaking in Treaty 8 Alberta to arrive at a similar mutual understanding of what the spirit and intent of Treaty 8 is. Because right now, the Crown's understanding is vastly different than the understanding of any of the First Nation peoples in this room, who are the descendants of the chiefs and headmen who adhered to that treaty. And I'll be quiet.
Do you guys want to maybe respond to that? Or?
That raises for me a whole lot of questions, Jim, but the question I want to ask first, just on your last point, how could you envision an independent body helping with that discovery of mutual understanding?
I think that the commission that they created in Saskatchewan would be a good working model. I was troubled when that commission's report was left to molder rather than being acted upon. I was also troubled by the book that was published by one of the head commissioners of the BC Treaty Commission, who said that the BC Treaty Commission was so bound by the rules around it that it had the potential for creating in BC the next Beirut or the next Middle East crisis because of the Crown's inability to achieve meaningful reconciliation through that interest-based process.
Okay, and Jim, my question is, you have a lot of history with the Cree people, and you have a little bit of history with the Danza, the Beaver people. So I'm wondering how much history do we have with what the I don't know, the Beaver people, the Halfway or West Moberly or Prophet? How much history do we have there to fight with?
I'll try to answer your question. The seminal event in the negotiation of Treaty 8 in BC was the massing of the Danaza warriors at Fort St. John and the pushing of the prospectors, the settlers, and the government agents down Taylor Hill and into the Peace River. That event signaled to the Crown and others that the tolerance that the Danaza had for others coming into their territory had reached a level where they were compelled to act to protect their relationships with these lands and resources, even if it meant violence. And the Crown people at Fort St. John at the time sent messages to Ottawa saying you had better send a treaty commissioner here to negotiate a peace, because if the Danaza continue, we will not be able to stop them. This is the first and the only incident where any Treaty 8 First Nation people actively contested the actions of the Crown and the settlers and prospectors acting under Crown dominion. And that it was an exercise in First Nation dominion under your own laws. I'm reminded of what the Danaza did in the early 1800s, around 1823, when the contemporary history tells us that the Indians at Hudson's Hope attacked Rocky Mountain Fort and killed the factor and his servants, and that resulted in the fur traders pulling back and not having a trading post there anymore. The First Nation account of what happened there, as I understand it, was that the Danaza and these fur company factors had a social agreement. They had a social contract. They had created an economy of interdependence. And the fur trading company unilaterally made a decision to close that fort, which would have destroyed the economy of the Danaza, but also the social contract that they had. So that those people no longer were a collaborative enterprise supported by the Danaza. They became interlopers and they were killed. And that was a legitimate action in the context of the worldview of the Danaza, because they were only there because they had this agreement. They did not have a right to be there other than the right the Danaza, as the stewards of those lands, had given them. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is in our regional strategic environmental assessment, where we've been discussing for the last 4 years this concept of peaceful enjoyment, which is the right not to be unreasonably interfered with in the exercise of your usual way of life. The words and their meanings in Danaza are essentially either very similar or identical to the words and their meanings as expressed in Cree. This is something that is very, very close in meaning. So we've had people from the other Danaza First Nations, from Doig and from Halfway, who have focused on how this word Pimatsuan would be said in Danaza to express this concept of the rules by which you structure all of your relations on the landscape. And the reason that I use the Cree words is because I understand the Cree words, having studied them. I have no language ability in Dunaza.
Jim, the history of the incident happening at Hudson Hope, that's still fresh in the minds of our people, that happened, the older people. And my great-grandfather, the reason why on the halfway reserve there's a creek that comes down and goes into the halfway. They built a cabin right in the middle of that valley there, and he stopped everybody going up the valley. That was a no-no. And when they came up, and at the time there was the Northwest Mounted Police, which is the RCMP today, but the reason why they invited them to go into the territory was they were working for the Great White Mother. A lot of spiritual happenings there. So anybody that goes up the valley, including Indian agents, prospectors, trappers, or just surveyors at the time they're trying to survey, they have to be escorted to get past, and they got to check in to go up the halfway valley. And if there's no check-in, then you gotta leave the valley. You don't have a purpose there. So that's around the same era you were speaking of. I thought that was better.
Thank you. That's something I didn't know about.
So just made a comment here.
Just so you know, Chief Darlene Hunter has joined us from Halfway. So that was the woman that posed the question to Jim earlier.
So just want to back this up a little bit.
I'm sorry, I gotta keep you all on mute because I got my grandson with me, and I don't need you guys to hear him running his down. But and that's why I wanted to know, because you know what, I hear and I heard a lot of stories from the elders from Halfway and how they traveled and I don't know how other nations came back in this community. So, and that's the only reason I asked. I asked because I just need, I don't know, I think we need to interview more Stanislav people in the 38 countries so that we have better evidence. And I know that Christopher and Tim, they have, and Rosalind, they got a lot of information that's recorded by the late elders of this community. And I think we need to put that information into.
It's Marina.
Okay, sorry, I'm done.
Oh, thank you, Chief. It's Marina, Chief Darlene. I very strongly echo what you're saying, because the claims process is, as we all know, largely a historical document review based on the government's record keeping. And as a TAR program working for our communities, we're annexing out our own community's historical accounts, which Jim and Chief Hunter have just been talking about. We're annexing out our own community's stories, their knowledge, their understandings of the world, of the relationships, of the treaty. All those things and more are cut out because of how information is supposed to be presented and how it's weighed and assessed within the process. And that's a huge thing, because it ultimately, what I say, it's an assault on the collective memory of our communities. It's the policy changes are eroding the people and their connection to themselves and who they are and their ties to the land. And the aspect that you were talking about traditional legal laws and orders being introduced is very important, as well as what Chief Hunter said. This independent claim body or process has to have a new way of how creating more resources so research can be done, but on the terms and the wishes of the communities, and that, you know, the way we talked last night about how the evidence is assessed and given value. The oral transmission, the oral history, you know, each community protocols and ways of bringing back knowledge and accounts forward has to be given merit. It can't be judged in different spaces all the time and hope that someone is going to give it attention and weight. So, you know, and we talked about the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and Kathleen, you mentioned that, you know, there is a big handicap with the process because of all the knowledge that's generated by Canada, but it's happening in separate silos. Well, that's an immense amount of money that's going to the SSHRC. And is there some way to look at claims research happening in SSHRC, or that a part of what SSHRC gets is actually controlled by our communities to address these big deficiencies within research for claims?
Everything that you've just raised and just spoken to is very much a live dimension of an independent body. And what could that entity do to facilitate the gap that the current process suffers from, which is highly documentary. It's RG10 files, it's Library of Archives, Library of Archive Canada. What balance could an independent body bring to research capacity, to the preservation of oral history, to the preservation of traditional knowledge as a repository, as its own archive? These are all the questions that we're asking in terms of its potential role, because a lot of the process itself is very much directed at eliminating that, or not creating a place for that, the voice of community, the voice of people, until very much later in the process, if it happens at all. Right now, it's about having a tribunals process where their rules allow for oral history evidence, if it's available. But it happens so late in the process, so many other decisions have been made on the basis of a historical record that hasn't included it. And the risk, the threat that poses is by the time the community, if it does access the tribunal's process, by the time it gets there, the people whose knowledge may be available are no longer available. And that's the threat.
Yeah, but you can't say that for every community, because we have, in our community, we have people, they're interviewed, they're on video, they have said what they have to say, and you have one of the elders sitting right there in the room with you, Maisie. She knows a lot of those stories. Jerry knows a lot of those stories that were told by the elders, and they're actually videotaped and they are put on record. So how come we can't use that?
No, all I'm saying, Chief Hunter, in asking the question about how we change and want to transform the existing process, isn't it that not to acknowledge that rich history isn't here? It's to acknowledge the fact that in designing a process or talking about the transformation of a process, what powers could that process have to ensure that there's a place for that? That's a component of its actual powers and authorities. Its structure is designed so that it's included as opposed to something that may or may not be included. That's all.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that. What?
Go ahead.
Over the years, in Doi, we've been documenting a lot of things. And since 1965, we have documented many things, and it was due to Robin Rittenton, and also we did a lot of documentation with Prophet, Blueberry, and some halfway stuff too, where there's evidence of our ancestors that were really close to the land, and they spoke in their own languages, their own expression, like dream mapping. You know, that dream mapping has been around for, hundreds and hundreds of years. It's an evidence of a relationships to the spirit dimension and the physical world. Those type of things are not included. We bring them out once in a while to talk about our perspectives. Right behind you is a painting that I created using those Charlie Yahe, you can see him inside there holding a dream map. Inside those dream maps and our stories, context that really clarifies our truth, spiritual truth to what's happening. Those things are never really used in the context of negotiation, because it has to be English or in a written word and you gotta have English speaking people that can write up these things for you, but it never captures the tapestry of the richness of that story, a song and the drums and the artifacts that the people have used in order to express their ideas. We need more of that in order to look at the depth of that knowing, because English word is very limited, and then you put one word in there that could describe something, but it's very limited to the description of overall deeper meaning. And I would like to see in the future how those type of things can be included as a complete thing. And a good example is, like, we can say, oh, let's go to bush camp. But then if I say to you, well, you're sitting beside a fire, nice fire is going, and there's moose meat being cooked. In our minds, you can be able to see that. Somebody's making dry meat over here, and there's kids running around laughing. We know those tapestries of that environment is what we seek, and that's what the treaty guaranteed, a peaceful recognition or existence of that. We call it Kema, Kema, Kema Titiya. Kema is a place that is pure nature, undisturbed by man. When it's purity, when you're part of that and you're there, that's when everything falls off and you're happy. Basically, you're just present to that moment. You can't capture that through the words and the reports. So we need multiple medias in order to tell the complete story. We don't have that opportunity today, and we need that opportunity to document it, the visual, even virtual reality experiences, voice activation, all these new technologies that's coming. We need access to that so that we can be able to better tell that story.
Almost lunch.
Lunch is on the way.
We still haven't heard from Peter. And you had a question.
Well,
Give a short
response.
I had a comment.
How long have we known each other? Keep it short.
There's three things that have been said. Gary brought forward the word Indunazon, which is exactly the word that came from Halfway and from Doig as a word that's compatible with Bimatsu and Cree. Those are the two words we're using to explain peaceful enjoyment, and in the context of an environmental livelihood study in the regional strategic assessment. The other thing that I wanted to say in relation to SSHRC, I sat for 14 years on a National Center of Excellence in Sustainable Forest Management Network. And through that process, we had a research focus on sustainable Aboriginal communities, which spent about 25% of the $7 million a year budget that SSHRC funded program had. The Sustainable Aboriginal Communities produced 3 different books documenting what they studied, and we made a recommendation upon the conclusion of that Center of Excellence that NSERC and SSHRC jointly consider funding a National Center of Excellence on Aboriginal Sustainability. That was not acted upon. What we have now are NSERC and SSHRC mini grants, which are much smaller and do not really serve the purpose that Verena was talking to. So if First Nation communities want to engage with the academic world and get third-party assistance in documenting and organizing their worldview, their language, the deep culture that they use to reflect what they think needs to be changed, NSERC and SSHRC could become an important independent funding source because it's governed by a different set of rules than the claims commissions are. And it's less bound by federal policy related to how you settle these things. That's all I wanted to say.
2 minutes.
Here, 2 minutes. I suspect we'll probably have to pick this up after lunch, but I think maybe what would help us with this conversation is to step back a little bit and look at what the intention was behind this specific claims process in the first place. The idea was to provide First Nations with an opportunity to obtain redress for historical wrongs, grievances, and injustices. And as an alternative to the courts, right, of course, where they would be typically subject to Canada invoking technical defenses like limitations. So that wasn't an option, right? So if we're still looking at that as the basic concept, that really should be framing our conversation going forward. And the first obvious question is, I mean, does it make sense to have it limited to just historical grievances, you know, with a 15-year cutoff or whatever? If you're talking about, you know, reconciliation as the buzzword of the day, but I think, you know, it's a good word. How can you have reconciliation if, you know, you're dealing with the odd historical grievance that you're able to tie up, but you're creating 10 more as you go along for the future, right? And that ties back to what everybody's been talking about, the connection to the land and the situation up here, where there's so many cumulative impacts to the traditional territories of the people here as to render the treaty effectively meaningless, right? So if you can't exercise your treaty rights if there's no land or animals left, right? So perhaps just thinking out loud here, but I mean, that might be a way of conceptually broadening the specific claims process to incorporate more. Maybe it's biting off more than we can chew, I don't know. But you know, I've been at this for 30 years, and I'm really surprised that I'm still tolerated here, because it's been 30 years of me coming and saying, well, there's 100 things we can't do because of the restrictions on the claims process. But I think there's this one thing that we could, you know, maybe pound that square peg into a round hole and, you know, let's give it a try. That's been the pattern for 30 years. It'd be really nice to flip that around and for me to be able to come here and say, hey, there's 100 things we can do and there's only one thing we can't. And, you know, I'm surprised it really hasn't come up in the conversation so far, but, you know, when you really think about it, with the specific claims process, you know, the people that really suffered as a result of these historical breaches of the Crown's obligations, a lot of them aren't around anymore, right? I mean, we've lost so many elders, and those are the people that really were owed the compensation. And so, God, whatever we do, surely timeliness of process and some kind of way of policing that would have to be integral to anything that would make any sense at all, right? So, I mean, that's the sort of 100,000 foot level 2-minute version of what I could probably go on for hours about. You know, as technicians, we could get down into the weeds and go on indefinitely about the particular problems, but I mean, if you really step back from it, that's what we're talking about. And you know, the other big picture thing, and perhaps the more fundamental inequity in the process that we've been up against up until now has been the ability of the Crown to unilaterally define what its obligations are, right? And that can't continue to be workable. Not if you're serious, you know. I guess I don't mean to personalize this. I mean they of course the AFN and the government. If there is a serious intention to look at UNDRIP and implement that, if the government policy commitments to reconciliation are serious, if the government is intending to take seriously what the courts have now been saying for at least 10, 15 years now, that the honor of the Crown is always at stake in its dealings with Aboriginal people, it's probably, you know, virtually every decision that, you know, we hear that from the courts, right? And I mean, if that's the case, and if there is a serious intention to implement what the courts are saying, what the UN is saying, then we've got to abandon or get past this situation where the government just figures it can have the Department of Justice come up with some legal opinion of its minimum legal obligations in isolation, right? Whether we can't see these opinions, it's a black box, right? And what comes out of it is this, you know, incredibly narrow, self-serving interpretations of the Crown's minimum legal obligations, and then that sets the parameters on the specific claims process, right? So how can that be consistent with reconciliation, honor of the crown, it's surely if the honor of the crown is to mean anything, it has to be more than minimum legal obligation, right? More than just the morals of the marketplace. It has to be something more.
And what role could an independent body play or have in equalizing that inherent imbalance?
Right. Well, you have to take away the ability of the federal government to define its own obligations, right? And that has to be handed to that independent third party.
Get the fox out of the henhouse.
Yes. Thank you, Stuart, for that analogy, because that's really what we're coming down to here.
But what I want to know is, how is the AFN going to help us to get what is rightfully owned to the elder people? When I've gone to your meetings, I've gone to them and I've been there, and I went there for the assets and ISETs and I don't know, you had like 10 minutes. 10 minutes, that's all you talked about of the assets and the ISETs. So I want to know how, and I know that you guys make a lot of law, and you, I don't know, you all say you're fighting for the community, but never once did I ever hear about you guys fighting for the Treaty 8 Northeast BC. Like, I've never heard it, and I just want to know. Like, we got documentation. At least halfway does, I know that. And I just want to know, how are you gonna help us? That's what I want to know.
Maybe if I could just elaborate on, perhaps on, take the liberty of elaborating on what the chief is saying. Here in northeastern BC, we've got a very unique historical constitutional situation where we've got the federal crown having negotiated Treaty 8 without the involvement of the province, which was an independent colony, entered into confederation with control of lands and resources. And so basically the federal government made a whole bunch of promises it couldn't keep, right? It's self-induced frustration. And that's what we've been battling here ever since anybody can remember, is this jurisdictional tug of war between federal and provincial governments. And every time they want to get out from under a treaty obligation, they plead jurisdiction. So it's been a constant source of frustration that we really haven't been able to get sufficient attention to, and it's holding back the treaty land entitlement claims as just one example of the practical implications. And so the conversations we've had here is that perhaps whatever happens with the specific claims process going forward, that there really does need to be some specific consideration of unique regional considerations such as the ones we face here. Is that a fair summary?
We have a situation where the majority of our issues are land-based, and the specific claims doesn't deal with that, right? So we've got all this issue, a third party sitting at the table that doesn't claim any responsibility to the treaty, making land-based decisions impacting our treaty rights, and no recourse other than going to court and having to sue them over that. I mean, we've got a decision, well, we've been waiting for a year on a response from them, from the specific claims branch, on our annuity evaluation. We've sent, I don't know how many letters we've sent to them, and no response whatsoever. It's like throwing it into a black hole. Like, there's nothing, like, no recourse, right? There's nothing there should be a penalty to them for that.
I think I need to clarify, and it just to take a step back for a minute. I think I need to clarify for Chief Hunter what it is that the AFN is doing and what we're not doing. We are here to hear your views and thoughts on what a truly independent, specific claims process could look like, what we would envision if we're the architects of a blank slate. We have decades of experience of how it doesn't work with what the current policy and the approach is. If we turn that on its head and we ask the question, let's design something different, not because we're responding to something they've already done, but if we're actually going to design something the way that we envision Article 27 of the UN Declaration, what would that look like? That's what we're here to talk about. The AFN in this capacity isn't negotiating any specific claim on behalf of any specific community or territory. Although I hear much of what you're saying, and I can tell you that we've heard the same frustrations in other places. Like, there are shared experiences with what is happening with the specific claims responses and lack of responses. But that's not what we're here to do. So in terms of being able to help, it's for this engagement, it's about being able to take what the chiefs said in their Chiefs in Assembly in 2017 in designing a truly fully independent claims process. What would that look like?
Can I just add a little piece? Chief Hunter, in terms of your concern and your desire for the AFN to provide some support where the specific claims process maybe doesn't address all of your concerns, I've talked to Verena, and we're going to arrange a conference call with the national office to see if there's something that we can do in terms of advocacy or support to have a better understanding of what role at the national level we might be able to play in supporting. And so we'll have that call, and we'll follow up and see what we can do. In terms of at the regional level, that's another question entirely with BC AFN and with some of the other regional organizations. But I can commit to following up and finding out what you guys think we could do to support. But that's separate from what Kathleen and Craig are facilitating in this specific process. But I also understand the concerns you guys are raising that the process itself is too narrow. It doesn't allow for some of these issues, and that may be something that you're bringing forward as a possible recommendation looking at it.
Well, that's definitely what we're bringing forward. You have to expand the parameters. So in the process that you're engaged in, you are talking about two things as I see it. You're talking about creating an institution, right? So how is that going to be structured? But the more critical piece from our perspective is, what is that institution going to be allowed to do, right? And what are the rules under which it'll operate, right? Mm-hmm. And we've seen this in the past. I mean, with the old Indian Claims Commission, I mean, the fundamental limitation there was that its recommendations were just that. They weren't binding on the federal government, right? So then we got an incremental improvement with a specific claims tribunal where now it has binding authority, but we still keep running into all sorts of problems where reconciliation ultimately is not going to be possible because the key historical injustices are not eligible under the terms of reference for that institution, right? So whatever institution winds up coming out of this particular sausage maker, whatever sausage you guys create, it's got to be a big enough sausage that it captures what is really truly important. And so what we've found is that first of all, the ability of the federal government to unilaterally make up those rules as to what is eligible as a claim, not as a problem, right? But also we've got problems with the interpretation of treaties, which is perhaps a bigger problem, right? But it's fundamental, and it permeates everything. In my own mind, to stay sane, I kind of break it up into two things, right? There's the impact on specific claims as they're conventionally understood now, right? So with the treaty land entitlement claims, for example, you know, there's it took, what, 27 years in Saskatchewan to come up with the equity formula, right? Yeah. To bridge the gap in the understandings, the respective understandings of the parties, what was intended there, right? So you've got that implication of the treaty interpretation problem. But then you've got federal government saying, oh, by the way, when we write our legislation for the Specific Claims Tribunal Act, we're going to eliminate the category of claims that are based on treaty rights of an ongoing and variable nature, right? Which cuts the heart out of the treaty effectively, right? And so if you're talking about reconciliation, how can anybody, any reasonable person, talk about a reconciliation if you're not allowed to address the core, the very purpose of the treaties, particularly in Treaty 8, right, which was the first of the northern treaties, right, that dealt with that passings in the Boreal Forest, where, you know, everything you read, whether it's the third person accounts of the treaty negotiations, the report of the commissioners themselves, or the treaty itself, the heart of the treaty is the preservation of the traditional mode of life and traditional vocations of the signatory First Nations. And the ink wasn't even dry on the treaty before that started being grievously violated. And that has been a consistent pattern ever since, right? And that goes to all of the contemporary concerns about cumulative impacts on the ability of the First Nations to exercise their rights in their territories. But it's also historical, and it's also going forward, right? It permeates everything. And yet, with that one clause in the SCTA, we can't touch that, right? So, again, whatever comes out by way of both the institution and the rules under which that institution operates, if reconciliation is the true objective, if people are serious about UNDRIP, it has to capture the heart of the treaties, and the heart of the treaties cannot be left to the federal government to define unilaterally, and you have to figure out a way to get past the jurisdictional problem, right? Because, you know, in the NRTA provinces, you've got a festering grievance about the narrowing of the scope of the treaty rights unilaterally through the NRTA, right? And here, because we don't have an NRTA, you've got a problem where the province says, oh, for treaty land entitlement, not our problem. We don't have an NRTA obligation, right? So the jurisdictional issue, that's something that has to get dealt with. And so let me just leave you with that. It's lunchtime, but that's the 100,000 foot pass at it.
And let me leave you with this for the afternoon. So there are we have, you know, just scratched the surface on each one of the topic areas that we have to delve into. And what you've just spoken of, Peter, is very much in our questions. You know, if we're looking at the back end, the adjudicative process, what needs to change? What process would make it more fair and impartial, accountable? And so the types of issues you're raising are very much a part and parcel of that. So the 4 topic areas are resources, financial, the funding, sort of how we even access processes right now, and what role an independent body may have in just leveling the playing field. What is a researched and developed claim that's advanced? How do we get there? How could an independent body help facilitate that? Where we're creating more of a balance of
of resources. What happens with a claim to get to, what is resolution? Is it just monetary? Is it something other than monetary? What is implementation of a settlement agreement? Because for many, the experience has been, once the agreement's negotiated, that seems to be this, that's viewed as the success. Leaving the implementation of terms of settlement for another time, another day, and in the interim, development proceeds, lands aren't acquired, lands aren't converted, whatever the terms are, what's full implementation, and who's overseeing any of that? What larger oversight needs to happen to create accountability? And then finally, when we talk about resolving disputes, right now the process is designed with a tribunal. But what other role or authorities does an adjudicative process need to have? What more could it be doing? So each one of those components, we really do want to hear the thoughts and perspectives, and those are the four. It's not to say that we're replicating what's been done, but we've just described the process in a way that we want to ensure we get to each of those topic areas. So if we break for lunch and we resume, our desire is to start there. We won't obviously. We'll continue to scratch the surface, but that's where we'd like to go.
You bet. We understand that, and we're prepared for that conversation. We have looked at the questions.
Okay.
Awesome.
Should we break for lunch?
Yeah.
Are you wanting to ready? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. How long do you want to take?
Let's do half an hour.
Back at
All right,
1?
guys, let's get this out of the way here.
Start
Back at 1?
Is there lunch?
Yeah,
Yeah, lunch is in the back.
Lunch is doing prayer for us before.
lunch is.
Changes are necessary on the funding side in order for the independent process body, whatever it ends up being. More importantly, where should that funding be held? How should it be administered, et cetera? Those questions, I think, a lot of money that all communities, our centers, et cetera, have access to. Research, negotiations, and the tribunal, and it's just not there. If you have reviewed the questions already, maybe we can get right into the discussion aspect of that. Hearing from someone, what you see is whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I'll start.
Okay.
Well, I think we mentioned that already in regards to having a regional office. I mean, everybody's going to say that their circumstances is a lot different than everybody else, but ours is really unique. So we need our own funding out of the tribal council to look at various claims and coordinate these claims as the research is done to put it in priority sequences, because we can't do everything. And that's what it's collect information. First of all, do the research, and also to make sure that there's priorities, and also put it into themes, because there is certain, 150-year history. I mean, I think Peter actually said as soon as the thing was signed, it was already being reached. So those type of things is a separate issue. And then we need to deal with that somewhere along the line. But what is the immediate things that we need to look at and put those as a priority sequences and make sure that everybody gets on the same page? For example, TLE. That's already an offer on the table by the government, and many of the communities are already into it already. So it's right here. We need to get that done and then move on to other low-hanging fruits that is doable within a very short time period. Longer ones, of course, we've got to keep fighting for integrity of the treaty and even revisiting. I like to see here from all the communities what treaty means to them today. We know what it's in the past, but it seems that everybody else can evolve and develop new ways of doing things, but yet Indians are considered the 18th century mentality, only hunting and trapping, but yet they've given out all kinds of license to hunters and gatherers, or hunters and outfitters and everything. And they can be able to charge anything they want to make a good living for themselves. But we can't seem to get to that level. So.
Maybe I can pile in a little bit on this issue. So I think everybody needs to be clear here that currently the way it works is that Indian Affairs decides who gets what, right? And they divide the funding up into two types. So for the research, you get grant funding, right? It's contribution funding. And then once your claim is accepted for negotiation, like for TLE, you become eligible for negotiation loans, right? And those negotiation loans, typically the practice of the department has been to top up your compensation component of your settlement by the amount of your outstanding loans. But you have to settle in order to qualify for that. And in the meantime, those loans sit on your books as a liability. And theoretically, you know, if you don't settle, Canada could call the loans, right? So I think step one maybe is to divide it into those two categories. Obviously, the question of negotiation loan funding is problematic. It's incompatible with the level playing field because you've got the sword of Damocles hanging over your head if you don't settle, right? It's just basically it's a problem where the more negotiation loans you take on, the more pressure is on you to settle so that you can repay them, right?
What's this sword thing?
It's just an old myth about somebody who had this sword dangling over their head. It could fall at any time and they wouldn't know when. And, anyway, so that's one thing, right? The problems with the contribution funding for centralized claims research units and individual First Nations, I mean, we all know what those are, right? So the question is, can we better address them by moving the responsibility for the funding to an independent body, right? The one thing I think it's a great idea. No matter what, it could be administered worse than it currently is. But are we risking politicizing the independent claims body by doing that, right? Because it's inherently competitive. There's a finite pot of dollars, and First Nations are all competing for that pot of dollars. So that's, I guess, a worry. I'm not sure that it's solvable, but.
I think one of the elements of taking it out of or revising what happens now is to neutralize the power that money has throughout the process, because it still rests in the one party that's the constant. So if the potential is for it to be in an independent body, it doesn't have an interest in the outcome as the parties might, but yet it still comes with challenges as to how could that be administered, right? It's still going to be a limited pot of money,
right.
But what could we say about a redesign?
Yeah. Well, I'd say the only things you can do is make it as objective and transparent as possible, right? Which the process isn't right now. And particularly with the negotiation loan program, you've got a sort of a compounded conflict of interest, because in order to get your negotiation loan funding approved, you have to have a sign-off from the federal negotiator. Not a good thing.
We have to have a sign off for the work plan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, again, you know, if this is moved out of the palsied hands of Indian Affairs, I think that's a great step. But you're still going to be left with some challenges with the independent claims body of work. But I think the solution, again, would be sort of transparency and objective criteria, and if it's tied to, I mean, there are now sort of commonly accepted, I think, stages to the whole claims process that actually, and interestingly enough, were developed here. We developed those stages here, and those are adopted now nationally. And so, if you have First Nation, because you know the difficulty is that some centralized claims research units and some individual First Nations are going to be productive and others not, right? And so if there's a finite pot of dollars, you know, the productive First Nations are going to be resentful if money is going to places that aren't doing anything with it, right? So how do you do that? Well, you can tie it to deliverables that are measured against the stages of the claims process, right? And so if everybody is held to the same standard, at least it will be equitable and less subjective than what happens now currently, where there's the black box making decisions in Ottawa and nobody knows how or why they're making their decisions.
I think one of the things that's also important to understand about, like, to say, let's keep it at the grant stage, the research grant stage. In the lack of a transparent sort of repository of research, same studies or same topic areas continue to get researched and funded. And when we talk about a process that's been around for decades, there is without question duplication of research. So are there ways in which some of the way that we're talking about funding being delivered by an independent body is also assisted by other pieces changing, right? So if it's a repository, if it's an archive, if it also has the ability to facilitate the gathering of traditional knowledge and oral history, and it has all these other pieces, objective criteria, and what becomes transparent it becomes more, there's a more direct way that it's funded. Like, there's a more direct benefit. Because you're not having
adoption records, RCMP arrest records, right? And also sometimes political, right? The genealogy is sometimes political, right? The traditional land use information sometimes is politicized because of some of the commercial things that we talked about earlier, commercial implications. So, in my experience, there's always been a very strong interest in maintaining the confidentiality of the research results. That may not be universal, but it's certainly been my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody else wants to highlight on that issue. But on the face of it, it makes sense, right? Because even here, we duplicate work constantly, right? But perhaps it's necessary.
But I want to say on Halfway's behalf, it took us a really long time to get our information from 3H back to our own community. Once we got our tax department and our archiving stuff put back here, we had a hard time, and we had to actually hire a independent person to come in and give us back our stuff, and I don't even think we have it all back yet.
So, Chief, if I could just clarify that a little bit. So, Obviously, any research product specifically for Halfway First Nation can be transferred instantly and without any difficulty or problems, right? Because it pertains exclusively to Halfway River First Nation. So that part of it is not an issue. But when you do, as the TAR program here has done over the years, bulk records acquisition, like that, in order to provide everything that pertains to Halfway River First Nation from the raw data that we have, right, then you have to sort through it, and that's where somebody had to be brought in to separate out the stuff that was specific to Halfway from everybody else's stuff, right? So it becomes a challenging thing resource-wise where there's only mine, right? And so, again, you know, when it comes to the funding question, the centralized claims research units necessarily wind up acquiring extremely valuable records over time that need to be preserved. And it's not just RG10, right? When there's a huge, vast repository upstairs, I mean, the engineers told us that if we brought in any more paper, the building would collapse, right? So literally, seriously. You know, it's a huge legacy for the communities, right? And it's a preservation of the record of their communities, and the TAR shops also collect audiovisual materials, a lot of oral history that's irreplaceable, and so you would start running into serious costs in properly maintaining those records, right? You know, you have a constant process of dealing with deterioration and acquiring proper archival storage supplies, you know, everything from acid-free envelopes to digitizing old tapes, right? I mean, it's a very expensive exercise. No funding provided for that at all through the specific claims processes that currently stands, right? So then as a result, the communities have to make a hard decision and divert resources from research and writing into maintaining these records. And it's challenging, right?
Do you envision a role that an independent body could help with that, or no, it's the way there's a proprietariness that needs to be maintained, so it's about maybe finding resources to help with it, but the desire is to maintain the collection?
That's a hard question. As I said, I think that the stuff that's generated through the claims research process is going to be difficult to get agreement to share, and I think legally probably it wouldn't even be possible because of A2K. But there is generic information, right, that is useful for everyone, and it's scattered all over the place. So if there was a process of gathering that publicly, the stuff that's in the public domain that is generic, that is useful. So for example, Union of BC Indian Chiefs has a fantastic, huge, long-established library of material. You've got University of Saskatchewan, who's got a huge repository of very useful information. And so these resources are scattered all over the place. And not readily available, and you have to know where they are. And, but that's where I see the possibility.
But I do think that an independent body. So, for example, you know, almost every claim up here, not quite, but almost every claim up here starts with treaty number 8, the making of treaty number 8, and you know, and that's the RG10, you know, and so if an independent body had the whole RG10 file on treaty number 8, then, and that was made accessible to First Nations free, so they don't have to send somebody to ACT Ottawa to get their copy of RG10, right? You know, that could help reduce costs. I mean, that would be fine, and so, or you don't have to be part of UBCIC necessarily, or part of the other, you know, to access those files. So people who have paid to access Library and Archives Canada material, obviously, you know, don't want to give it up to people who are strangers to them, right, to their organizations. because they paid for it. So whereas an independent body could replicate those archives, would make them free for all, and access those general archives to all nation claimants. And that to me seems like something that is kind of where you're going, I think, with some of those, what would the benefit of that independent body be, right? The proprietary stuff that Peter's talked about is valid on specific, particularly, I think when it starts delving down to specific decisions and specific fact patterns for individual nations, but the generic stuff on the Making of Treaty 8. Yeah, I mean, we had to replicate it for the Western Boundary case, right? It's just crazy. And, we replicated it from TAR, and then we got the same files from Canada, we got the same files from BC, and, we've got, 50 different versions of the Treaty Commissioner's report. Well, you don't need all that, right? You just need a good copy. And if the independent body had that, that would be fantastic. That would be a helpful. Yeah. Would it have like a 20% reduction in costs? No, but it would be helpful.
There is a precedent for that, actually. That's the old Treaties and Historical Research Center that used to exist within the department. And people like Dennis Medill were hired on there as permanent staff and researchers, and they cranked out this generic information, right? So when we started researching here, that's what we did, is we went there and we were handed a copy of, here's the department's research on Treaty 8, right? And we were able to save an awful lot of time and energy and work. And God knows where all the records and all that went from there, but we constantly accumulate that kind of stuff. So we do these bulk acquisitions of these kind of generic materials so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But that's your precedent, I think, for what you're talking about. The other interesting thing about that treatise and historical was that it was set up to facilitate specific claim researcher access to departmental files, right? So you would go in there and you'd sit down with one of their staff, and their mission in life was, right? And so you'd say, okay, this is my research project, this is what I'm looking for. And they would go away and they would pull stuff out of the Ottawa Federal Records Center, they'd pull whatever central records material was relevant. They'd pull all of that, you'd show up the next day and there'd be a stack of files like this, right? And they'd hand it to you. And so, and by the way, the photocopiers are down on the 6th floor, and knock yourself out. Right? There wasn't any of this, vetting of the files and redacting 3/4 of it and all of this. The files you'd order back then would be this thick. You order the same file today and it's this thick, right? It was golden times. And so if you're talking about true transparency and reconciliation, I think that keeping the records of the government that pertain to your issues secret is incompatible with that. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a story that's pertinent to this. Peter, Treaty 8, researched a hunting, trapping, fishing claim for the Little Red River Cree Nation in the 90s. And he did a fairly exhaustive search of documents. When the Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta entered into the treaty-based governance negotiations with Canada, Alberta sitting as an observer, I was commissioned to write a paper on what Canada was doing to protect the usual locations of Treaty 8 Indians in the early post-treaty period. So I used, with the permission of Little Red River Cree Nation, the research that Peter did, augmented by some other research, to document that between 1922 and 1938, Canada was negotiating with Alberta for the establishment of a series of exclusive hunting, trapping, and fishing areas for identified Indian bands. And they called them special reserves. They had created, I think, 5 of these in the Northwest Territories as it existed before the NRTA was established. One of those was the Wood Buffalo Park, which spanned the boundary between the Northwest Territories and Alberta. And throughout the process of negotiating the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, there was an active dialogue between Canada and Alberta about the need to create these areas Indians from white competition. So we had a well-documented archival record. We had, created maps based on the metes and bounds descriptions of these areas. And in western Alberta and south and northeastern BC, these were significantly large areas. They were order of magnitude 25 to 35,000 square kilometers in size. That is part of the research that was submitted to Canada and Alberta in support of these treaty-based negotiation processes. Canada Alberta, through their research unit, treaty research unit, sent us a letter saying, thank you very much, but our interpretation of this information is it represents nothing more than a failed policy attempt and has no relevance to the NRTA. The position that we had presented to Canada and Alberta was that the Supreme Court of Horsemen got it wrong. We followed the minority decision saying it could not have been Canada's intention to extinguish the hunting rights commercially when they were negotiating throughout this period to protect them through the establishment of these types of reserves. So
people to be assigned to that task.
Yes.
So it goes on both ways. Because the funding part of it only goes to the actual research and development, but what about the people from their department and the community side? We definitely need to look at that too.
Maybe Jim, just to give me a half a second, because I want to comment on this point because it's really critical.
Peter, Jim, Chris.
Sorry. Under the Harper government, we saw the department got it, right? I mean, all of a sudden, at the TLE table, they couldn't meet, they didn't have money to attend meetings, they're firing all their contractor negotiators, there's no, you fire Canada down the hall in Ottawa, not anybody apparently, right, as far as we could tell at our end. So yeah, there has to be corresponding capacity to deal with claims at their end as well, absolutely. So sorry, guys.
The point that I believe is you may be working at the wrong end of the tunnel. The first thing you need to do to move towards reconciliation is to get an acknowledgement that we don't have a shared understanding of things like treaties. And strive to develop one. There's been a lot of work done on that, but it's never been accepted and used as a basis for moving towards reconciliation. So I know in Cree, idea of provides a better understanding of what we agreed to with the Crown. And the Crown will acknowledge that. They insist that Treaty 8 was an extinguishment law. We never achieved reconciliation until the Crown moves off of that idea. And the only way to approach that is either through discussion and negotiation or by taking the bastards to court. Discussion and negotiation is a far better option. The same thing is true with the NRTA and Treaty 8 in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. Because the Crown is hung up on horsemen. Got a Supreme Court decision that says it was the intent of the Crown to do this, and we've got 6 rooms full of evidence to show that wasn't the intention. But until they take cognizance of that and examine it and try to redefine for themselves what they really meant, you're not going to get anywhere. So in the treaty-based governance process, one of the options we identified for Canada was simply to take the evidence that we had and submit it by reference to the Supreme Court and ask the Supreme Court, did the court in Horseman get this right on the basis of this new information? Or do you want to reinterpret this? And the federal government said, no, we choose not to do that. There are a number of First Nations, as I understand now, in Alberta, who, having settled their cows and plows claim and put a sizable number of millions of dollars in trust accounts, are looking at the commitments that they made 20 some odd years ago when we started negotiating that claim to build a war chest and sue the bastards. And I would imagine that if they decide to do that, the kind of suit that they will launch is going to be on these foundational issues of, was the treaty an extinguishment document, and did the Crown intend Section 12 of the NRTA to extinguish commercial rights? That's not a preferred option. But in the absence of any will at the Crown's level to move into an arena for discussion and negotiation, it may be what's necessary. So some of these foundational issues, which most of the sociologists and anthropologists say reflect a shallow view of history that Western governments have, need to be addressed I think without a lot of research being necessary to support them, because they're mainly grounded in differences in language and differences in deep cultural meanings and differences in worldviews that are structured by these deep cultural language meanings. But nobody's ever came at that problem from this direction, with the possible exception of the Saskatchewan Treaty Commission, who struggled to come up with this, shared understanding of the spirit and intent of the treaty.
So I was going to make a statement, or I guess a comment and a recommendation. So building on your statement that even specific claims branch doesn't have enough funding to do their own work, and something that Peter said, once the Harper government implemented the tribunal, the other thing that we saw was the specific claims branch and a huge ramping up of the Department of Justice. And so specific claims went from, Canada was just an executioner, but the department still, it was overwhelming research and negotiation focus. And there were a lot of people working in the department that were trying to rectify these historic grievances. There weren't enough of them, but there were people that were trying to do, and the focus was different. Once the tribunal came into effect, the cynical long game there was to adjudicate all claims, negotiate only the most obvious low-hanging fruit, and throw it all to the lawyers. And the lawyers were told to defend Canada's liability. So they were hired thousands to adjudicatize, like that's not a word, but taking stuff that should have been a dialogue between researchers, between First Nation researchers and government researchers on what is the nature of the claim and how best to settle it, and really very much a dialogue focus to an adversarial focus. And so the whole shift was gutting the people who wanted to engage in dialogue, ramping up the people who wanted to engage in the adversarial process. So that's the comments. I think that an independent body, again, there's lots of different existing models that we could look at to tweak and build from. But if you look at several of the human rights organizations in Canada, they very often have a commission and a tribunal. So they both have an investigative inquiry function under the commission. And then they have a tribunal, specialized tribunal that adjudicates only the ones that the claims that can't be settled, that are irreconcilable, that a decision has to be made about. But this independent body could be multifaceted, so that we're not just making all claims inherently adversarial in nature, because that's always going to result in not enough money for the specific claims branch, not enough money for the First Nations, because it's about minimizing Canada's liability the minute you make it adversarial. If you shift back to a model like a Human Rights Commission, where there's a statute that sets out, and also it's the commission that decides whether the minimum standards are met, not the Department of Justice, right? These sorts of things. So there's lots of different kinds of institutional models that could be built into this independent body that walks and talks and looks very different to either the specific claims branch now or the specific claims tribunal. I mean, the tribunal could end up being housed within this larger independent body as the adjudicative branch of that larger body, right? But it wouldn't be the only branch, right? It would be for just those cases where the parties couldn't come to a negotiated outcome. But overwhelmingly, the focus would return to having a dialogue, to rectifying these historic grievances, to achieving reconciliation, to rebuilding trust between Indigenous collectives and Canada. So I think that that is a different funding focus as well, right? But we've seen it, and we've seen governments from time to time fund human rights commissions, realizing that you need a commission to sort of be the overarching champion for human rights writ large, or specific claims claims writ large, with a specialized adjudicative role embedded within that larger institution. So I think that would be quite helpful. It would have a different funding focus, but it may help also move past some of the funding roadblocks that we have now, because the focus would be different.
Thanks, Chris.
Can I just add something here? It's Allison. So any process or any independent body that we may establish, as Christopher has outlaid, I think would continue to be hampered in its efficiency if it was underfunded like the tribunal is currently underfunded, and if it's got a legislated settlement or adjudicated cap, like we're currently dealing with this $150 million cap. And the reason I say that the cap plays into the delay of resolutions of claims is that we've learned that it basically incentivizes Canada to slow down moving claims forward, because normally when you're litigating and you're on the losing side of it, you know that the cost of settlement or the cost of the award that will be ultimately granted is increasing with the passage of time. And we're looking at historic claims, and especially in Treaty 8 BC, where we've got high value oil and gas, a loss of use claim can escalate in value very quickly with the passage of time. But Canada isn't paying for that passage of time when they hit a cap. And basically they're topped out in how much they're going to have to ever pay after so many years of delay. So they're no longer being penalized like a normal litigant would be by delaying resolution. And we have seen that firsthand with a claim that we've got in the tribunal for in Treaty 8 Nation that was filed with Canada in 1999. Canada took a decade to reject it. It was filed with the tribunal as one of the first claims filed. And at the time that it was filed with the tribunal, I would assess that the value of that claim was likely slightly under the cap. 10 years later, it is well over the cap, but that won't matter because the tribunal can't award anything over the cap. So 20 years after it was filed, loss of use continues to grow. Canada delays, misses deadlines, brings motion after motion, doesn't agree to reasonable pretrial schedules. The tribunal doesn't have the capacity to schedule things in a reasonable time. Overall, like being at the tribunal now for almost 9 years without a final settlement or final resolution as loss of use continues to grow. So funding the independent body and not having a cap that rewards Canada for its delay will be critical in creating a process that really will achieve reconciliation.
That is both a revealing and a disturbing example, Allison. Because part of the challenge, well, it was perceived at the time that the tribunal wouldn't be the first recourse. It would be the ultimate recourse if Canada kept to its preference to negotiate. And so the challenge, and I take all of your points, because I think the neutrality and the impartiality of an independent body is not to reward delay in any capacity. And what's disturbing about what you're describing is when the tribunal opened its doors, it was presented as the final arbiter, right? First Nations were going to finally have recourse after they exhausted the specific claims branch. They would finally have recourse to a binding decision maker. But in order to go there, two things were necessary. They needed some decision or not. A 3-year time frame had to pass, so there had to be a lapse of 3 years. But they had to accept the financial jurisdiction of the tribunal. And doing that on the basis of what they forecasted their claim to be worth in order to do that, although not having the resources in advance to do those studies about compensation. So having identified what ultimately they thought the value of the claim would be, but if what you're describing is even having done that and accessing the tribunal, and over the delay of proceeding through the tribunal, the value of the claim has exceeded is never what would have been contemplated. And so what that leads me to think is in directing towards an independent body, what is the need for that kind of threat, or eliminating those kinds of threats, if it's really truly going to be a fair process, that neither party is rewarded for drift. Because the irony is, if you have a body with rules and a rigor to its own process, you're somewhat protected from that happening. But that obviously.
We talked about that this morning a bit, about having some kind of rough equivalent to a case management judge to police the process, right? So Christopher was talking about the commission versus the adjudicative function, but perhaps there's a third component to the body which would have a process policing function.
I think if I can just add, like, we of course have case management with the tribunal, and we've had it since the claim got picked up in the beginning. But with the financial resources on the tribunal being so strained, we're on to our third justice because of the delays due to retirements, and even scheduling, like agreeing to a reasonable pre-hearing schedule. We've had 3 hearings. We've succeeded at every one. We're in the final stage, but it's necessarily 1 to 2 years between hearings, just because of all of the internal hearing, the steps that have to take place in between hearings. That the tribunal, although the judges or the justices have been very good to First Nations, and we don't have a complaint in the substantive outcomes. They've come to communities, they've been reasonable, they've been fair, they've been interested. The problem is that we've got Canada on the other side that seems to manage to get away with a lot of delays and missing deadlines, and then sort of begging for forgiveness and getting extensions, and then it's their right to bring interlocutory applications, and they do. So litigation is time consuming. We all know that. Those who litigate, and the nations in the room right now all have a lot of experience in litigation, and know that it is just a very time consuming process that stretches out far longer than it ever should. And the risk, of course, with that is that the loss of use is mounting in the interim, and that's exactly the example that we've seen, which is incredibly frustrating. And like you say, Kathleen, it likely wasn't the intention with the cap, but it doesn't take much to get to $150 million if your claim is historic enough and based on high land values. It's a very short turnaround before you're blowing right through that cap.
Do you want to take a break? Is this a good time for a break?
What other questions do you have?
This, I think, in terms of the scope of this what we've covered, we've talked about funding, and I think we've talked about research development, claim development. What we haven't talked about is resolution. And this, in part, goes back to Ardith's video, what she was remarking on in the video, and what we're using to describe as remedies. And how are we viewing remedy in a reformed or redesigned, transformative way? And then we are getting into a bit of the adjudication just by Allison's last example. So the last 2 topic areas are claims resolution, which we're also where we want to include about implementation. having, you know, what role would an independent body, could an independent body play in a facilitative way or in any way? In that and in the resolution or in adjudication. So those two topic areas.
Yeah, I think what Chief Wilson was mentioning, that we have in the past give authority to organizations to take care of stuff for us, but then they go rogue on it, you know, and then they do their own thing, and then they decide they're the judge and jury. So that's the concern, you know. How do we control that in the context of giving authority to independent body, a commission, to do its job and help facilitate these claims, but not go become the Indian agent?
So should there be some oversight over that body?
Absolutely. There's got to be something that somebody's got to look at it, and if there's any community members saying, hey, wait a second, you know, what you're doing is you're not, you know, making our things priority, or you're whatever. There's issues. They should be able to go to somewhere and say, we're not being treated fairly here, and we want a hearing.
So if the independent body publicly reports, it should be reporting to all parties, First Nation participants, or First Nations, just Indigenous people generally, like everywhere, Government of Canada, and then the remark was made earlier about an international report.
Why can't we have an international United Nations oversee it or something like that, as under their, you know, section 21, is that, or
47.
47, to use those framework in order to ensure that that's happening, and then you have some timelines that everybody understands. This is where we at. So you don't have what Allison described as where, okay, we'll do our work and then we get it done, and now we have to wait for government to do their thing because they haven't, and that has happened many times in our processes. Just like what the BC government has did here. You know, they were on the table all along, and they knew it was coming, but then when the time came, oh, we didn't know nothing about it, we don't have the mandate, you know, and then that now throws the whole process off.
One of the things that we wanted to ask is, the way the system works now is Canada controls the access to a negotiation process, to a table. When they say yes, and what First Nations are seeking when they make the submission or in the first place, is that Canada would agree to negotiate any of its claims, but that rests in the hands of Canada to decide. Is there if we redesign this, if there's a redesign of this relationship, what role could an independent body play in that?
Oh, it would be like, it'd be like a Human Rights Commission, right?
Yeah.
It would decide whether the minimum requirement is met. It would decide whether the requirements under the statute, there was a valid claim that had to be, that Canada had to then sit down and negotiate. Perhaps Canada still has 3 years to say, no, we're not going to because we're nasty, right? But the commission would be the one that says, this is a valid claim to go forward for negotiations, and if that doesn't occur in the next 3 years, then the tribunal has jurisdiction to adjudicate over the claim. But I think that you take that threshold decision-making out of the hands of the department, right? And you put it in that independent body. You have to. You know, when human rights complaints are lodged, the commission looks at it and says, does this trigger whatever, whether it's the provincial codes or the federal code, right? And the human rights commissions are the ones that, now you can judicially review those decisions, sort of, right? But they're the gatekeepers, right? And then they decide if it goes for an inquiry, if it goes for a mediation, if it goes to adjudication. And I think the independent body would have to have that. Otherwise, you know, all of the systemic problems that we've been talking about all day just remain bottlenecked in the department.
just to respond a little bit to your comment about oversight, if you look at the kind of historical record of some of the processes that have been envisioned in the past, they envisioned some type of tribunal in 1998 in the Joint Task Force, and there's other ones, and they had kind of joint appointment roles, right? So if you had a commission that wasn't necessarily judges, you could have a body like the AFN and Canada jointly appointing commissioners, or you could have some type of process where whoever's in charge of that commission, that First Nations have some sort of role in choosing those people.
Yeah, and to have credibility, the independent body would have to draw not just from the ranks of the department, right? There would have to be, First Nations would have to be able to have some mechanism to appoint their own commissioners, and then maybe that, there would be commissioners that would be appointed by the department's nominees and the First Nations nominees, and they would be, a third, or something like that, right? But you could structure the governance so that it had broad credibility, and you might even want to have some of them coming directly from professional researchers, whether they're academics or otherwise, right? People who actually have a vested interest in doing history right, as opposed to manipulating it for you know what I mean? I mean, I don't know. Like there's all kinds of different ways to structure the governance so that it has broad buy-in and broad credibility across all the two parties in particular that are using it. I mean, another issue that comes up are the provinces bound? Like, under the Specific Claims Tribunal, they can be invited to participate, but they're not bound. I think that the federal government has the authority under 9124 to say that if a province is a proper party to this, they must show up, right? So if it deals with, Crown, like again, Crown lands in BC, right? That the province owns that. Well, guess what? They're compelled to show up, right? They so stuff like that, so that the jurisdictional gap doesn't get played against First Nations, because it never gets played in the Fed's favor. It always gets played for the detriment of First Nations, right?
Well, let's talk about remedy, because
Right.
remedies involve, right now, we're limited in the adjudicative process to cash. It's a financial compensation. But what else, but what about mine?
Well, that's and then if you bind the provinces to this independent body and that they're subject to it as well, right? Then, for example, you don't have having to slice and dice. Is this an NRTA jurisdiction? Is it not an NRTA jurisdiction? Does like all that stuff, right? So that if land is a meaningful remedy to achieve reconciliation, then you have a way to put it on the table through the independent body. I don't, for blue skying things, then
Yeah, we are.
as well scoop the provinces in there too, right?
And one of the questions that I thought was really interesting about Artist's video is how we are describing loss. I mean, her examination of what it is to include Indigenous law into a specific claims framework. How are we describing what the cost of disruption is?
And that widens the remedies that would otherwise be available at common law. So one of the advances of the Specific Claims Tribunal is the elimination of limitation periods and laches. But why stop there, right? I know in the residential schools litigation, the loss of culture, loss of language was always pleaded, but never was adequately resolved, at least in the court cases. And so, that remains a live issue. The common law by no means guarantees damages for loss of culture, loss of language, heritage, intergenerational effects. All that stuff has yet to be made real and tangible in the common law. Well, a legislated independent body could say, yeah, those are compensable losses. You know, you lose your culture, you lose your, you know, and what are the intergenerational effects of not having this land for 100 years or more, or 200 years? You know, oh, they could be pretty big, right? You know, and that's something that the parties should have to talk about, right? Well, you know, you put that in your legislative shopping list, well, then you gotta talk about it, right? And Canada just can't, their lawyers can't say, yeah, well, you can't get that at common law, so we're not even gonna, that's not even on the table for discussion. Oh, sorry, it's in the legislation, we have to discuss it, you know? And if you don't discuss it with us, I'm sure the tribunal will be very interested to hear about it when we get there, right? You know, I mean, like, these are the kinds of things that I think could, will they ever level the playing field? No, but they could really do a re-tilting, right?
What about specific performance as a remedy? Like a lot of reconciliation here is necessarily going to have to focus on changing the way that the Crown and First Nations approach land and resource management. Because right now, it's seriously out of balance. There's too many things going on. And so to reconcile, you're going to have to put limits on resource development and economic development to allow forest conservation to be implemented. And you need forest conservation and restoration to restore the landscapes that the exercise of treaty rights depend upon. And it is not a matter of compensation. It's a matter of
Restraint.
well, restraint and restoration as a vehicle for allowing the level of peaceful enjoyment of a constitutionally protected right to be actualized.
This could give you a couple of examples, tangible examples of what we're up against with this, maybe three. So in the negotiations for Treaty 8, there was an explicit promise, well, repeated in a number of times, regarding the protection from interference in the traditional religion. And so we've been trying to figure out, I mean, this has had major repercussions, obviously, but how do you address it through the specific claims process, or can you, right? So we've been in the communities talking to people and trying to figure out how to deal with this. And, you know, you've got the problem that most of the infringements took place as a result of the residential school system, right? So you're up against the policy constraint against claims based on programs and services, right? And so that's a too narrow scope of what's allowable under the policy, obviously. Another claim that we've got that right now that has been mentioned already that is a problem is the annuity valuation claim, right? We pioneered those claims here. Canada is now a year over the 3-year deadline to respond to it. But in both cases of both of those claims, you're also up against, you know, what, not only what are the damages, I mean, show damages in like pecuniary damages, which is what we're limited to in the current process for the religion claim, but also for annuities, the program is saying, well, okay, so we can settle this claim for the failure to adjust for purchasing power historically, but what do you want to do going forward, right? So now they're wanting to talk to us in a sort of pre-acceptance engagement to try to scope out what this could look like, which hopefully is not just a way of stalling us, right? But the point is that, you know, they're now starting to look at the go forward as well, right? So again, then we're into unconventional territory in terms of what a resolution of a claim looks like. And then you've got what Jim's been referring to, which is, again, going back to the heart of the treaty, where you've got the land-related and traditional mode of life-related promises in the treaty, the sort of sine qua non of the treaty, being completely ineligible, and how do you, what is settling a claim based on that gonna look like, right? And so that's, I think Tim's point, is we've gotta look at changing the way things are done, right? So all of these things are completely off the table as it sits right now, and they have to be put on the table if you're talking about full reconciliation and fully respecting the historical treaties, not just a unilateral interpretation of them.
So how?
So these are really big questions.
These are our
right?
big thoughts, and
Yeah.
they're big, but we want to ask them in order to really have this kind of transformational approach. So how would what, just to follow through on what you're describing, Peter, and what Ardith was expressing, how do we introduce Indigenous concepts, or what would be the concepts around law through ceremony and song and relationship, mutual responsibility? How do we introduce that into this process? How would that be received by the body? Is it necessary that they come here? Is it necessary that the access is the body, the people whom are responsible for it come here?
Well, for sure. I mean, you mean the come here in the communities to meet the people? I think you need to understand the spirit of the people in order to understand the context. So that's an important piece. But didn't Val Bulling and her programming, she has a pretty good clarity about how that law is formulated out of stories and traditional knowledge. So I would say recommend those kind of contexts put into play. So is that what you're asking?
I am.
Val Napoleon, like with 4 of our Treaty 8 communities that are here today, she is embarking on research in her department at the university under the, I think they're looking at it with a particular focus on laws and governance systems related to water, and looking at their methodology with respect to breaking down a story and looking at the different parts of the story and what it's telling, what it's telling us in terms of relationships, the laws, the governing legal orders that the community had. So that's underway, and so there are there is a research team put in place. They just started.
But it's happening.
I guess the one thing I might want to point out, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah. We have a stretch break because people are
A break?
Yeah.
Take a break?
5-10 minutes break for a stretch or something?
Sure.
Well,
Come back next
really
week.
hurt.
Go right around the block. Get caffeinated.
The result, sociologically, is what I would call enemy. They call it in Cree homeland, which means despair. People lose their way, become disconnected from the community's values and from each other. They become disconnected from the natural world that they live in, which kept them grounded, and they despair. Despair is destructive behavior and suicide. And destructive behavior and suicide are rampant in all of our communities. The elders would say that's because of all of the things that have been done to us within a colonial regime. But in this video, these elders say they are partially to blame for it also, because they didn't resist it more. They say that the way you approach reconciliation is through actions that help these communities re-establish, re-establish this notion of community wellness that is grounded in this philosophy of the Gnatsuan and good relationships with all of the aspects of that. So it goes from this notion of a spiral that goes from the individual up to the cosmos into a medicine wheel formation that says these are the ways that can be used to keep order and lead to what Gary defined as happiness, which in Cree it's Mino Panatsun, which means everything is good. But in English it's expressed as community wellness. So we use it to talk about in impact assessment processes in our dialogue with industry and government. But then we can't measure community wellness in our communities by the number of hospital beds there are, and the number of social services there are, what the economy of our members are. Those work in non-Aboriginal communities. But First Nation communities are much more organic, and community wellness is a function of these relationship patterns between the individual, the family, the land which created them, and the cosmos, their vision of their relationship with the Creator who gave them the laws that they are compelled to follow in order to maintain community. That's where we start in our discussions with the provincial government and hopefully with the federal government on this walk towards reconciliation is the provincial governments like to talk about of development or a three-legged stool. Society. In Alberta and here, Treaty 8 has said your stool would be much more stable if it had a four. This relationship between man and nature. So that's my lecture for the night.
Thanks.
I wonder, Jim, if there is if we're envisioning what what a new process, what a different process could do to be able to facilitate getting there, because part of the challenge and what you've just described is so profound. It's simple and it's complex at the same time, and I don't mean simple in it's so clear. It's so clear and it's profound and it's complex at the same time. And how in the claims environment, where we have disruption of relationships to land, you have displacement of people, we have colonial government structures, you have department direction, you have statutory, all of these various mechanisms that come into this relationship, and how it is that this independent body could continue to facilitate the education, because what you've just described is so profound, and perhaps more easily understood here. But what would be necessary for an independent body to be able to facilitate that learning?
Two things. The creation of what's called ethical space, and the requirement for what is called truth-telling. Truth-telling can only occur and only be heard and understood within an ethical space, because the truths are different, and within this room here, the truths are slightly different between each of the Danazaw First Nations, because it is uniquely their truth, and it's not exactly the same as West Mobilie's truth or any other First Nations truth. And for the last year, we've been going through a terribly divisive process over the need to protect and restore caribou habitat that threatens jobs and resource development opportunities for all of us. Because what we have done is outside of any ethical space. It's been a polarizing process. So, again, in Alberta, in some of the processes that are going there, the government has recognized the need for creation of ethical space, but they've never yet created one. And we're hoping to do that here in our dialogue with the province over wildlife and wildlife habitat and other matters affecting the exercise of treaty rights.
What's needed to create that?
More than I could go into today. I'm not, I know how it works. The best example I can give you of it is only an example. In Wood Buffalo National Park, there's been an ongoing dispute between one group of scientists who say that the drying up of the Peace Athabasca Delta is the result of natural processes. It has nothing to do with building dams on the Peace. There's another group of scientists who are saying, well, there's some natural process involved, but the construction of all these dams on the Peace is principally responsible for what's going on in Wood Buffalo. And the World Heritage Committee has told Canada, you've got to fix this. In Wood Buffalo, for about the last 10 years, we've had a Peace Athabasca Delta Environmental Monitoring Committee. I sat on that committee. that committee formed a subcommittee of elders and people I call graybeard scientists, people who've been scientists long enough to get over it. And they sat down for about a year and a half and talked to each other. They then identified the major source of threat to Athabasca Delta and came to a consensus. And they said the biggest threat to the Delta is the hydroelectric regime on the Peace River. Now, in scientific parlance, that is what you call convergent validation, because you have two different worldviews, two different value systems, two different knowledge systems reaching an agreement on what's happening. And that has value. Sadly, that report's been finished for at least 4 or 5 years and never been released by the governments. But that's the best example I can give you of ethical space. It requires that people explain their worldviews and their values, but not hold so fiercely other value systems and the relevance of other knowledge generated in those systems. So if you could create a commission that had the mandate to approach this from an ethical space perspective, and in retrospect, I think that the Treaty Commission in Saskatchewan accomplished parts of that. They certainly got the First Nations perspective on the spirit and intent of the treaty, but they never got, to the best of my knowledge, a corresponding Crown or non-Aboriginal perspective.
I think at minimum, really, it requires breaking the pattern of policy-driven and minimum legal obligation-driven settlement negotiations. I mean, we used to have the government at least purporting to be willing to do interest-based negotiations. That went out the window. And so if the institution was able to implement more, well, basically something along the lines of what Jim was describing, but certainly something that's principles-based. Periodically in defined breach of the Crown's lawful obligation. It removed. Allison, you might want to pile in on this. I'm sure Allison knows to a settlement that everybody can live with for sure.
mentioned yet, but, and I'm always involved, well, for the time I've been in the TARP program, I've just been involved in the research stage, so haven't had too much opportunity to see what's going on in the negotiation and later settlement stages. But I do have a little bit of a preview with our communities now who are trying desperately to near a settlement for their tree line entitlement claims. And so that is an example, the level of frustration felt by the what third-party interests are doing in terms of their ability to reach settlement, and just that the communities just really taking a better look at how the government is approaching the outreach to the general public. Communities are approaching outreach to the general public to educate the general public and those third-party groups about their claims, the nature of them, and what it really, those really stories of injustice and wrongs that are like really tied to the land, which now is shared by others, but in a way to give the community capacity and the platforms to be able to have a fair chance to get to reach an understanding with the general public and third-party people that they can get respect, and that there's not going to be people that frustrate the process, that there will be people that are compassionate and at least to some degree are not going to try to intervene or derail it, because they have here, and it's outrageous. And I think that that's entirely missing. Where is there a separate body, or even that's resourced and actually has the time to manage this and look at this? Our communities, their teams have to try to stick handle all of this. Well, there's too many people in the public and that have different levels of interest that want to know, and how much effort it takes to sit down with someone and in a calm in a persuasive way, but also in a way that gives them the time to have that slower education. And it boils back to that across Canada, like the history of Indigenous people is totally not properly represented, and it's mischaracterized, and there's huge gaps. So that is at the crux of it, and also the claim settlement is about. So I don't know if I've explained it well enough, but I just think that is very, very huge.
Just to kind of add to that, one thing that we noticed when we were doing the background research in terms of what's been said before, time and time again, people, when they're calling for an independent body, one of the elements or key functions of that body is to play some type of educational role, because that currently doesn't really exist. I think there's there'd be ample support for something like that.
So we've covered we've covered all the topics that we wanted to get through today. So thank you everybody for your input. If after we're done, if you've gone home and said, oh, I really wanted to bring something up, etc., provide his email address. And the AFN will be taking written submissions. If anybody wasn't here that wants to submit recommendations or comments, that can be done up until November 30th. Correct. And then the next steps for us is to continue hopefully to wrap up by the end of November. There will be a draft roll-up document that will be done and sent out to communities for review, just to ensure that we get that done right. And then hopefully by July of next year, we'll have something to present to the Chiefs in Assembly.
But first of all, and not quite critically, in terms of the settlement of claims, a key piece that I've observed is the development of settlement trusts, particularly for the larger settlements, because you can have a successful claim agreement with the Crown, but the end result can be either very positive or very negative. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of central repository of knowledge of best practices on trusts that's reliable and that would be trusted by communities that could be used. And that's, I think, a resource that's desperately needed, and if the independent body could provide support to the communities in developing their settlement trusts critically early in the process, because if you leave it until 5 minutes, disaster. So to get into the communities, and this, what I found is that it takes a fairly large financial investment in doing it right, because you have to spend time with community members, you have to give the community members time to think about the implications of alternative trust structures and allowable purposes in those trusts. So we have here a lot of experience with that. And so that's one thing I want to mention before you close, because I think that's a really key piece. There's no point in selling the claims if it's been counterproductive. The other thing, I guess, maybe is a point of emphasis, because really having thought about coming into this meeting and what was really the one key point to all of this for me, is that looking ahead, process critical, but also the parameters of it. So the definition of what is a specific claim, that is the heart of it. Because as it stands right now, the things that are the most important to the First Nations in terms of the relationship with the Crown are off the table, by definition. And so if there's one thing that comes out of this, I mean, if we could roll back that Specific Claims Tribunal Act prohibition on things, very nature, that would be the single biggest win. Because that's, if anybody's really serious about reconciliation, how can you possibly conceive of ever reaching that without talking about the heart of the treaty? And what I mean by that is, by the treaty, of course, is not just the unilateral Crown definition of the treaty, but it's the spirit and intent of the treaty. Yeah. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that, but that's the heart of it for me.
Thank you for that, Peter. I'm sorry, I think I'm going to lose my voice at some point. It has come up that in resolution and implementation of a settlement, one of the challenges is being able to inform without influencing a structure. So is it in what your first point being best practices for presenting information in a way that doesn't influence or isn't influenced by the financial institution that might have an interest in a certain direction or a certain outcome. So it has arisen, so I'm glad you raised it here, because you're echoing a sentiment that's been articulated, that there is a need potentially. And it is a resource-driven, intensive of time and capacity. And then the second about the parameters, I think I take the sentiment, because it was I think a really significant part of our morning discussion as to where that's grounded and why that's. So I would invite, even if it isn't exhaustive, it doesn't need to be lengthy. But if there's anything in particular that we could read or that would reinforce any additional background materials or research, I'm sure if it doesn't exist, it'll likely be somewhere that's pretty far. All of that. It should be an additional resource to read. By all means, please just direct us through Aaron's email. I think that's a significant part of our day, taking this class that way.
Does anyone else have any final comments?
Actually, I've got one. It's Allison. And it may have been already considered, but in transitioning to a different, of course you don't know where we're going to end up with any of this, but I'm just reminded of the last transition in 2008 when we went from the ICC to the tribunal. And unfortunately for the nations in this room, we had a claim that was in front of the ICC. It was the consolidated annuity arrears claim. And it had been, it had not been rejected. It had not been accepted or rejected. And we took it to the commission, and then Canada promptly rejected it. And we were heading towards a hearing date. We were meeting to discuss lists of issues. And then the Tribunal Act came out, the policy changed. And if you didn't have a hearing date scheduled, your claim fell through the cracks and it got dropped. And so everyone's annuity claim got dropped such that they had to rewrite it, resubmit it into the new process, and wait 3 years when we were already at the ICC. So when I hear about changing structures and changing policy, of course I encourage, because we have a lot of flaws we need to address and things can be done better, but at the same time we need to be very careful with transition provisions so that no one loses time, so that claims don't fall through the cracks and we don't end up starting over on anything, because there's so much effort and time and resources put into these claims, and to have a setback like that was really, really disappointing to all the nations in the room.
Yeah, there has to be some sort of grandmothering clause, right, that anything that's currently happening gets rolled over onto the new independent body.
No, that's a fair point, Allison, thanks. Okay. Elder, could you do a closing for us? That would be great.
Anta Woodrona translated on te generation te te nota te tawatia te jinja na te jilka Woodrona te just shit on te but you don't you get not to jilka